Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back. It is show number 37 of the MMA podcast that brings you fighting talk with a distinctly British flavour. My name is Simon Head, and joining me, as always, is Mr. Chamatkar Sandhu on the other end of this very high quality Skype line. I'm very pleased with it this week. Sandhu, how are you, mate?
I'm very well, and I guess aside from our passion for MMA, we're both very happy football fans this weekend. Yes. I know that Gillingham stayed up in Division 1.
Yeah, by the skin of our teeth. By 1 point. And if Port Vale had managed to score a goal in the last 5 minutes of their game, then I'd be crying into my beer right now. It was that close. So, yeah, we're good. And your Spurs boys have... St Totteringham's Day has been banished.
Yes, finally.
For those who don't know, St Totteringham's Day is a day that was basically invented, I think, by the Arsenal fans. And that was the day where Arsenal fans would celebrate the point of the season where Spurs could no longer mathematically beat them in the league. That has not happened this year because after years of promising the potential of finishing above their red counterparts in North London, Spurs have cemented their place above Arsenal in the Premier League table this season. And not content with that, they're going for the title, mate. You just need Chelsea to slip up twice, but you do need them to slip up twice. I think you're 4 points behind. Is that right?
We're 4 points behind. Look, at the end of the day, we can only do, our end of the deal, right? We can only keep winning our games and hope for the best. Chelsea have been absolutely phenomenal all season long, and but yeah, this weekend was fantastic to get one on the Gooners. At the very last game at the White Hart Lane, as it's currently known. The new stadium is currently being built. That'll be up in a couple of years. Looks like we'll be in Wembley Stadium for our home fixtures all next year. But that was very sweet. It was very, very sweet. After years of just kind of being the laughing stock in that particular rivalry, it's always a good one to get one over them. Yeah. And it was great. It was kind of bittersweet to see, actually, because I watched it from home, and the atmosphere at an Arsenal Spurs game, whether it's at the Emirates or at the Lane, is always something really special. It is one of the best derbies in the world, in world football. It's right up there with Man City United, Liverpool, Everton, and Barcelona, Madrid, and I worked there. I worked at the Lane for about 4 or 5 years back in the day as a steward, and I worked at Park Lane right in that away section. So I had my earful of plenty of abuse back in the day from the Arsenal fans, and and that's the last one. That was the last Arsenal Spurs game at the Lane as we know it. But it was a good victory for us. Like you said, Simon, we've still got a few games to go, and who knows? Maybe this title race will still take a few twists and turns. I'm hoping it will.
Yeah, I mean, any excuse to beat Chelsea will just make everybody's day happy, I think. So yeah, and you speaking about Spurs are going to have a new temporary home, Wembley Stadium. Wembley Stadium was really the centre of the combat sports world this past weekend. And as we mentioned on last week's show, we're in a bit of a gap period, aren't we? There aren't that many big live MMA shows for us to consume at this point. The next big one comes up in a couple of weeks' time, UFC 211. Is it 211 or 212? 211.
211.
211. Stipe Miocic versus Junior Dos Santos. That fight card is insane. We will not talk about that this week. We will talk about that next week as we give you a full and comprehensive Brit Pack style preview of that event. What it means is we've got a bit of a gap week this week, but mixed martial arts, as in terms of the name, is a mixture of all the great martial arts in the world, one of which is boxing. And boxing really did take centre stage this weekend. It took centre stage right here in the UK at Wembley Stadium in London. 90,000 fans packed the stands of that magnificent stadium for Anthony Joshua versus Wladimir Klitschko, the biggest heavyweight championship fight for many a year. And heavyweight boxing has been in the doldrums for a long time, Sandhu. I wouldn't call myself a student of the game when it comes to boxing, but I do watch a fair bit of it, and I've been following it, ever since I was a kid. And heavyweight boxing really since the Lennox Lewis era kind of died away, and then the Klitschko's rose to prominence, it just started to fall flat. The belts, which were unified for a while under Lennox Lewis, then started to become fragmented. The two Klitschko brothers, Vladimir and Vitaly, both held versions of the world title. They refused to fight each other. They promised their mother they would never fight, so they didn't fight. As a result, it started to break up the heavyweight championship picture. The fights became less and less interesting because of the way that the Klitschkos fought and the fact that they were physically just overly superior to everybody else. Plus, there was no real heavyweight talent coming out of America, which was is traditionally a real stronghold for heavyweight boxing. Now things are beginning to turn around again. The Americans got Deontay Wilder. We've also got Anthony Joshua over here. Tyson Fury, when he can get himself in shape, is a very, very dangerous fighter and was, of course, the heavyweight world champion. But this weekend it was Joshua versus Wladimir Klitschko. What a fight, Sandhu. I mean, we watch combat sports as often as we can. I know you're not the most frequent boxing fan, but just from the the whole package of the show, sitting down in front of the TV and tuning in to watch that, what an experience that whole event was.
It really was, and I mean, I remember growing up as a massive boxing fan throughout the late '80s and all throughout the '90s and the early 2000s, and I kind of just petered off, just when kind of mixed martial arts was coming into into the array for me personally, anyway. And like you said, Simon, it kind of coincided with the fact that heavyweight boxing was dying, with the Klitschko's kind of holding those belts up for ransom, essentially, especially with some of the matchmaking that was going on. And over the years, it's basically become a European sport. I think in the last couple of years, with what Frank Warren and Eddie Hearn have done, it's essentially become a British sport, boxing, in terms of especially the heavyweight title picture. You mentioned they got Deontay Wilder in America, but to be fair, like, I haven't really seen any of his fights. Like I kind of described today in 2017, I am as much of a casual boxing fan as I suppose there is a fan of the UFC that will only tune in for a Nate Diaz McGregor fight, right?
Yeah.
Or a Ronda Rousey fight, right? I'm not following boxing on a daily, weekly situation whatsoever. I couldn't tell you much about the undercard. I know that Katie Taylor's got a big prospect coming up now. She's under the Eddie Hearn promotional family, I suppose. And look, at the end of the day, what this did, and I followed this particular fight only because it's in our backyard. It's in London. It's in Wembley Stadium. The minute I heard they were going to try and sell 90,000 tickets and put a heavyweight title unification bout on with a Klitschko. Klitschko still holds a name, and obviously from a distance, I have been following Anthony Joshua. You and me actually saw his last fight a couple of months back at the Grosvenor Casino just before a UFC event, actually.
We did.
And I couldn't believe it, the way everything came together in terms of the bells and the whistles, the promotion. I was a massive fan of the promotion leading up to this fight, and of course, they've got this deal with Sky Sports, which essentially means for weeks and months you're going to get prime time exposure and advertising and media hype build up, the press conferences, the weigh-ins, the shoulder programming. It's all in tune for the British viewing public, and I'm not surprised that there's talks of this doing over 1 million buys. I'm not surprised that they completely filled out Wembley Stadium. And then you put that all aside just to see the walkouts, so epic, so larger than life. And then, of course, finally, the fight itself was just ebb and flow, back and forth. Both men went down at various points. It was a very evenly contested fight right up until that 11th round when Joshua got the business done. And I just thought it was a landmark moment, again, from my perspective, from a casual fan's perspective, and I've seen this statement written online and social media a lot. It is the biggest and the best heavyweight boxing fight for quite some time, maybe the last 10, 15, 20 years. Like you said, probably since the Lewis era, especially with those bouts he had with Holyfield.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really is how far back you've got to go before you find a heavyweight title fight that really carried and captured the imagination of the world, not just the UK or the US or the Germany/Ukraine market, where the Klitschko's always used to fight in Germany, and it was a very they used to sell out all the time, and they were a huge draw, but they wouldn't put them on pay-per-view in America because no one wanted to watch 12 rounds of jab and grab from Wladimir Klitschko. Klitschko used to be a really slick boxer when he first got in to the heavyweight scene and was rising the ranks. He used to be a kickboxer actually, and then transitioned into more traditional boxing. And then he got knocked out badly by a South African by the name of Corey Sanders. And ever since that fight, he fought a lot more sort of safety first, very defensively. But he's had a ridiculous career. He really has. And the thing that has always struck me, you can criticize maybe the style of fight sometimes, and maybe some of the opponents that he's fought, but he really did beat everybody that there was to sort of take on out there. And okay, he might have presided over a slightly weaker era, but I don't think it diminishes him as an athlete and his ability. But the thing that came across, and even on Saturday after he lost, his class in defeat, I thought spoke volumes. It was interesting because there was zero trash talk going into this fight. There was no back and forth of any kind between Joshua and Klitschko. Incredibly respectful of each other. Sky love to do this, and I know they do it in America as well. The old head-to-head interviews, chairs turned backwards, sitting there. I think Johnny Nelson, former world cruiserweight champion, was presiding over proceedings as he does, and there's no heat between them at all, really. And for a fight to sell that many, and I fully expect it to pass 1 million pay-per-view buys, and for it to generate that much interest, fill an arena of that size with no trash talk whatsoever, that tells you, A, that the market for the sport over here is huge if you put the right people in the right place. And it also tells you that you don't necessarily need to go down the route of trash talk in order to become a box office attraction. Anthony Joshua has proved that. And yeah, his performance on Saturday was outstanding. Withstood some incredible pressure from Vlad halfway through that fight. Looked like he was trying to end it early, couldn't get it done, then started to struggle in the middle rounds, and then found his second win, came back and stopped him. Amazing stuff. Now, it's worth sort of transitioning across. This is an MMA podcast. Well, obviously, we're talking a bit about boxing because it is the big sort of combat sports event of the weekend. When you look at an event like that, Sandhu, and you look at how it's put together, how feasible is it that how possible could it be, assuming all options were available in terms of television distribution and all of that sort of thing, arena availability, that we could one day see the UFC holding an event of that sort of scale?
That's such an incredibly hard question to answer. I think there's so many moving parts here and so many discussion points. I think, first of all, you look at the UFC and the schedule of events they have, there's just no breathing room. You look how, Joshua Klitschko had weeks, close to maybe a couple of months of build-up towards this one big event. You just will never get that in the UFC. They're always moving from town to town, from country to country, on a weekly basis. There's just not enough room in the schedule to actually take a pause and build up one big mega fight. I think if the UFC were to do anything like this, they'd have to pull literally every magic trick they know and every big superstar together to create a massive supercard to try and even think about doing a massive stadium like this. I know there was talk in the States of them perhaps going to the Cowboy Stadium in Dallas, Texas. Now you've got a stadium being built in Las Vegas for the Oakland Raiders, who are moving from Oakland, of course, to Las Vegas in the NFL. And you would think that with that being in Vegas, that perhaps in the next 4, 5, 6 years, that would be the best place for the UFC to try and attempt a stadium show. But also, again, you have to look at it from markets. If the UFC ever did this, it wouldn't be in Europe. It wouldn't be in the UK or on Ireland. It'll have to be in America because it's an American sport. If you look at the UK, in the last couple of years, what's been the two biggest events or the two biggest fights we've had in the UK? Well, the first was Michael Bisping versus Anderson Silva, and that wasn't shown when there was an opportunity. It wasn't shown prime time, unfortunately. It was a Fight Pass exclusive.
Yeah.
Right? And then following that, when he was the champion, the very first British UFC champion, coming back home in his backyard in Manchester to defend his title for the very first time, it was at 4 a.m, and those are the missed opportunities. And again, that may not be a missed opportunity for the UFC, because it's clear that the UK market, as important as it is not as important as a North American pay-per-view audience and market. That's where Eddie Hearn, Matchroom Boxing, and the promoters of boxing here in the UK, they don't care about the US market. They care about the UK market. That's why every weekend, I think on Friday night, you've got Friday Night Boxing on Sky Sports, right? That's why every couple of months you've got a big fight taking place, whether it's at the O2 Arena or like this past weekend in Wembley, and it's for the UK market. Yeah. Anthony Joshua and Klitschko took place between 10 and 11 o'clock at night.
Perfect.
Absolute perfect peak prime time. You can imagine pubs and bars, sports, absolutely packed. I know there were a few that were doing, advanced bookings for tables and seatings. That just never happens for the UFC, right? It just never happens. So when it comes to the UK market, I just cannot see it happening. I mean, the absolute closest you might get something to the nature of a Joshua Klitschko is if eventually you get a McGregor fight at Croke Park in Ireland, right? But even then, who knows if it'll be prime time? Who knows if it'll be at 4 a.m? And that may be a one-off. But that's, that is the absolute one-off in McGregor being a global superstar. But yeah, if you're going to do something like that, it's going to have to be in America, and it'll have to be an absolute stat card, multiple title fights. You literally will have to use your top 2 or 3 biggest draws. Like, I'm talking, if Rousey is still available and willing to fight right now, you're using a Rousey, you're using a McGregor, you're using a Diaz brother, you're using an Anderson Silva. That's the kind of star power you would need. And in addition to that, weeks and months of build-up and preparation and promotion and shoulder programming through all their channels to try and build something like that up.
Yeah, I also think that if you put a big mega card on at Wembley Stadium at the equivalent time that we saw the Joshua Klitschko fight on, you could, with the right card, you could fill the stadium. But the problems are not with filling the stadium. The problems are with everything around it, as you say. The reason why this thing's going to do 1 million pay-per-view buys, right? That we've just, that Joshua Klitschko fight in the UK, and this is just, see, boxing as a pay-per-view sport works in this country. Nothing else does work as a pay-per-view sport, and only the very, very elite boxing matches. ITV tried to launch pay-per-view with Chris Eubank Jr. fight. Now, Chris Eubank Jr. is a world championship level competitor. He fought a guy no one had heard of, Reynold Quinlan, I think his name was. I think he's Australian or New Zealander. No one knew him. No one knew him, and I don't think that pay-per-view did very well. Anthony Joshua versus Wladimir Klitschko, that did all right. And, Anthony Joshua versus Tyson Fury, or Joshua versus Klitschko 2, or Joshua versus Deontay Wilder, they will all sell. If you do them here in the UK, they will sell, and they will sell big. We have a pay-per-view market in the UK for top level boxing. We don't have a pay-per-view market in the UK for MMA. And we won't ever have a pay-per-view market in the UK for MMA until we start getting superstar cards at prime time. And because the American market is so strong and bullish right now, to take an event away from that, to put it over here, is only going to hurt their bottom line. So it's kind of a vicious circle. It's not going to happen until they take the risk of putting a show on over here at that level. But to do that, they're taking a financial hit. So it doesn't make any sense to do that. Until we get a British world champion. Well, I mean, you see, Conor McGregor has kind of outgrown the equation now, isn't he? He's an American superstar. You know, I spoke to a guy in a cafe the other day, and he has no idea about MMA. He's one of the few people I've spoken to who he said, I'm honest, I have no idea who this Conor McGregor guy is. And then the guy who was working in the behind the counter was like, you don't know who Conor McGregor is? He's done this, he's done this, he's done this. And all the other people in the cafe are like, yeah, he's really good, he's really good. But this one guy had never heard of him. Everybody, I think, is going to have heard of Anthony Joshua after this weekend. He's a superstar within our own country. He's a gold medalist in the London 2012 Olympics. He's got the backstory. The thing that you mentioned, which I understand what you're saying, but I also think that it can be changed. You said that there was a run-up for this fight. And I think you're dead right. There was a run-up for this fight. Now, what you said is there was no room in the schedule for there to be a run-up to a UFC fight in the same way. But actually, is that true? Because you then went on and said, and this is in no way me picking you apart from what you've said, because everything you said is spot on. You said they had a run-up, because they did. Promotionally, they had a long run-up, and it paid off. But they also still held Friday night boxing events, other smaller pay-per-view events. So the thing that happened here was the matchmaking was done for, they basically said, this is the big fight that we want to make. This is the one big fight we want to make. We will make it, and they will draw a line in the sand and say, we've announced the fight, we've given you the date. But there's an age between the announcement of the fight and the actual fight. And they're slow playing it, just chipping away. And with the benefits of being on Sky and Sky Sports News, and we've spoken about this with regard to the potential for a UFC, future UFC coverage on Sky, that was able to play out while still holding these smaller events. Whereas with the UFC, they don't really seem to do that. It's, here's our events, bish, bash, bosh, and they're almost treating the fight night events and the numbered pay-per-view events, in terms of how they announce them, largely the same. You might get an on-sale press conference here and there, but really you don't. If they say, let's say for argument's sake, McGregor wasn't going to fight Mayweather, and they decided on, I don't know, let's say November the 5th, right? Just to pull a date out the hat. I don't even know if it's a weekend. Firework night in Vegas, McGregor, Diaz, 3. You could announce that today and say, we're going to have that fight on such and such a day, and just slow build it. All your other stuff can still be going, but you've almost got like two concurrent timelines, if that makes sense. Whereas what it seems to be like with UFC, it's one timeline with a load of events on it. Does that make sense? And I think they almost need to elevate some of these pay-per-view events over and above what they're doing promotionally now. Like the Miocic JDS fight, heavyweight championship of the world. Lift that up, give it a 3-month build, and just slow play it. And just chip away with the ESPN stuff. Get them doing the car wash on ESPN. Not at the same time. Do Stipe 1 week. Then do JDS the next week. Do Fox Sports. But again, don't do it all in one great big hit. Drip feed it. And I think that makes the fights bigger. It gives people more content to put out. They're not putting out sort of content in one concentrated amount of time, because once you get to fight week, that happens anyway. So just slow playing it, and I think that's where Eddie Hearn did such a good job with the matchroom, with his matchroom team, and promoting this fight. It had a long run up. It worked. It wasn't to the detriment of the other stuff that they were running, and we saw the success in the ring on Saturday night. Yeah, I don't think we're going to see a 90,000 UFC show in London. I'd love to see it, but I just think with the business model, it's tricky. They'd have to change the way that they approach things, I think.
Yeah, and when I mean they need a run up, I mean no pay-per-views, because for example, you've got UFC 211 and UFC 212 taking place within 3 weeks of each other.
Very good point.
To ask the American public to pay $60 for one and $60 for the second within a space of 3 weeks, that's a lot to ask for.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that actually. Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Yeah, the fight nights, no problem at all, because that's on free-to-air TV. Yeah. That's where you want to be able to drip feed, a bit of shoulder programming, an interview here, an interview there, and that's where you're trying to get the wider public to kind of buy in for the pay-per-view. So it's actually the pay-per-view schedule. Maybe I should have been a bit more clearer about that earlier. But here's the thing: it's not as if the UFC haven't done stadium shows before. They have, and very successfully.
Yep.
They had Ronda Rousey, Holly Holm in Australia. They had Jake Shields and GSP in Toronto. They had just last year. They had Verdun versus Stipe Miocic in Brazil, right? I think I'm more talking about a big stadium show maybe in the States or a big stadium show in the UK, which is probably a little bit less likely to happen. But yeah, they're going to figure out somewhere, a pocket in the schedule where perhaps, like for example, at the start of the year, they cancelled the very first pay-per-view of the year, right? So there was a nice sort of gap there where you weren't asking your audience, your UFC fan base to shell out $60. But when they eventually do, you want to make sure it's a massive event. Yeah, so that's what I meant. But yeah, absolutely. Look, they've got the talent, they've got the stars to do a stadium show. It just comes down to, will we ever get something like that in the UK? I don't know. I still think that McGregor's the closest thing, and that'll be in Croke Park if that ever happens. But even then, you want to have a nice supporting cast, even though you've got McGregor at the top. And I suppose that's the caveat with the UFC, and that's the best thing about being a fan of the UFC, is you're not just buying in for the main event. UFC fans, MMA fans, for the most part, they pretty much will tune in for at least the entire main card, if not the prelims as well. And there's a lot of notable fighters that have been steadily built up over the years, having fought so frequently, 3 or 4 times a year. So, but yeah, I mean, it was just amazing to see the expo. And I guess a part of me is just jealous. The fact that you and me, follow and cover the sport of MMA so much, to see boxing get such a massive spotlight on it this past weekend, get such a massive shine, especially here in the UK. Like, I take my hat off to them, but I'm also jealous. I wish MMA had that. I wish some of the bigger stars had that. I wish a Michael Bisping, had that kind of exposure, because he's put just as much effort into his athletic fighting career as an Anthony Joshua. You know what I mean? But very, very happy for Joshua. That's 19 victories, all by knockout or technical knockout, and his star just continues to rise. And everyone's calling him the savior of heavyweight boxing. I think with some careful matchmaking, he's got some big paydays coming up now. He's already had a few big paydays, but let's see if he could perhaps bring the sport back to the US, because if you can do that, then who knows what the potential ceiling is for him over in the US.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I know the whole ongoing sort of comparison between boxing and MMA will never stop, because there are crossovers there. Boxing is an element of mixed martial arts, but as sports, they're run very differently. And I think even just listening to you talk there, the old brain was sort of clicking away to myself, and I was thinking about it, and it was like, the other thing with boxing compared to MMA is boxing is an incredibly fragmented sport, and mixed martial arts, as branded by the UFC, is an incredibly controlled and packaged sport. They're very different in that respect. So, to give you an idea, a hardcore or regular, a hardcore fan of any sport will follow everything about their sport, so that's a given. But let's just say a regular fan of the UFC, they will watch a world title fight, whether it's Demetrius Johnson, all the way up to Stipe Miocic, every weight class, and a lot of them will be able to tell you that you can sit them down and say, name all of the current world champions in the UFC, and they'll be able to do it without too much trouble. Now, in boxing, it's a completely different kettle of fish, because the fighters are all promoted by different people. The events have very little thread joining them together at times. Like, if you only follow the Matchroom promoted events, then it becomes a little more packaged, because there is more of a narrative that runs through, and they look to match make and push things forward and throw things ahead. They're setting up the next fight when they finish that fight and so on. Where in the main you've got people fighting in different parts of the world. But it's not all under one banner. So The people who tuned in to watch the Anthony Joshua fight, who are regular boxing fans, might not have watched the Vasyl Lomachenko fight a few weeks ago. The hardcore fans definitely will have done. Because Vasyl Lomachenko, arguably, is pound for pound the best fighter on the planet right now in the sport of boxing. He's right up there. Certainly from a skill perspective, he's almost untouchable. He's an incredible fighter. But we don't get much of him over here. You've got, again, he falls into the same problem that the UFC does, because his fights are on in America a lot of the time, because that's where he earns his money. That's where the big paydays are. So those fights are on between 1 and 4 in the morning. So that's almost the comparison we need to make. To compare Joshua with the UFC is almost unfair, because they're not like for like. Comparing the big American fights that happen stateside with the big fights that happen stateside in the UFC, then you've got more of a sort of a level playing field, because the fights are happening at the same time. We have TV access to both, and you see a stark difference between the two at that point, because one sport is very fragmented and you almost don't know what you're getting week to week, whereas with the UFC you've got this it's not a full calendar of events. They sort of dabbled with that a year or two ago. But what you do have, you've got this running narrative that runs throughout the entire calendar year. And because you've got it almost every week like that, it means that the pay-per-views are diluted a little bit because there's so many of them. If they only, let's say they did 6 pay-per-views a year, the UFC, so one every 2 months, that would give them that longer run-up that you were saying, and it would potentially allow them to really stack the deck on those cards. But the question is, for that to be financially viable, they need to make more money than they would have made by having one a month. And that's where it gets tricky, because fighters get injured, fighters pull out, and as we all know, if you lose a main event on a pay-per-view card, that could be catastrophic for your bottom line. So it's tricky. It's like, do you want one big hit that absolutely blows everything out of the water, or do you want to be at sort of 88, sort of running at 75-80%, if you like, every single time, pow 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 pow, and then at the end of the year you count up your chips, you'll have more money that way. The one anomaly to that is Conor McGregor, because whenever Conor McGregor fights, boom, jackpot. So, and I guess that's why they want him back in the octagon soon. But it is fascinating, the two different business models. I love both sports, absolutely love both sports, and I don't like, some people say boxing's dying, and not over here it isn't, mate. It's awesome. I love it.
I guess the one time a year, I reckon the UFC probably could get away with a stadium show, or at least gamble on it, is their July 4th weekend event, because that's kind of like almost their version of WrestleMania. Every year UFC are going to have a massive event in their backyard in Vegas over that July 4th weekend. You've got so many punters that are flying in for that weekend anyway to have a good time, right? So, you've got no lack of potential ticket buyers already in town that are looking for something to do. Plus, you've got fight fans that are going to be there for the expo and just for the whole international fight week experience. So if you're going to do it at any time, and obviously you want to make sure you've got some decent weather with a stadium show as well, that's probably going to be your best bet. But yeah, it's just fascinating. I saw Dana White, and he doesn't normally send out any tweets or Instagram posts for boxing too much these days. It's usually very much UFC focused and heavy. But he gave a special mention to the event, and in particular to Anthony Joshua. So that was pretty good to see as well.
Yeah, no, I don't see any reason why these two sports can't coexist. I mean, they certainly do in my house, and there is sometimes a little bit of them and us. Sometimes with the boxing media, you get the impression they sort of look down on MMA sometimes, and I think it is also guilty the other way as well. I think sometimes the MMA media look at the boxing media and say, crusty old dinosaurs and stuff like this, when the truth is probably somewhere in between. But two very different sports, but two great sports as well. We're on the Brit Pack. This is episode number 37. For those who are tuning in, thank you to everyone for joining us. We've been getting some questions, Sandhu. Let's try and rattle off a few of those and get some of those done.
Absolutely. Daryl Chumbley says, do Al Iaquinta's actions on Twitter, etc., help him in a strange way? He is bringing more attention to himself. Could that equal more pay? To steal a pro wrestling line, does controversy create cash? What do you think, Simon?
That's a very good question. The answer to that question is yes, providing he knows what's good for him and he basically makes peace with the UFC and does a deal. Now, the reason why Stone Cold Steve Austin is such a superstar is because in the eyes of the public and in the eyes of the fans, here was a guy who was sticking it to the man, right? His feud with Vince McMahon was one of the great feuds in professional wrestling. But of course, that feud would never be allowed to happen in a real workplace because if you had anything like that for like a week, you'd be out, right? Granted, pro wrestling is not real. Everything's amplified. It's all drama and all the rest of it. Al Iaquinta is having a bit of a go at the UFC, and some of the things he says, there's some substance to what he's saying, but the way he's putting it across, I think, is all wrong. And he's made his initial sort of outburst, if you like, but now he's got to tone it right down. He needs someone to take him to one side and say, right, you've made your point. You've told everybody how pissed off you are. He's certainly living up to his name of raging out, because he's been raging, that's for sure. But now what he's got to do is he's got to peel away all of the bluster and just stick to the substance of what he's saying. And because he's a good fighter. I mean, look what he did to Diego Sanchez after 2 years out. Unbelievable stuff. And being an outspoken character is fine, on the proviso that you keep it within the lines of, what you need to do. Because what happens if the UFC say, well, okay, we don't have to give you a fight for another 6 months. We won't give you a fight for another 6 months. Or, however it goes when it comes to contract time, they don't want to do that. It's a Bellator going to pay more? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I mean, I think Al hasn't done anything worse than, say, for example, a Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz and the Diaz brothers in general have been known to kind of F and blind here and there, and especially use social media. The difference between what Al's done and what, say, for example, Nate Diaz did last year is Nate Diaz is an inbuilt cult following of an audience, whereas Al's kind of star is still rising. He's not there yet, you know what I mean? And so it's a tricky situation for him. Now, could he be doing all this to try and get a release? Perhaps. But I think the UFC, regardless of whether they're going to act on that or not, what they've got now in their hands is someone that's grabbing some headlines. He's grabbing, the attention of the MMA fan base. And why not stick him on a card? Listen, you stick Al Iaquinta on a Fox Sports 1 main card right now, and I think you're going to have people tuning in just to see what he might say next. So, but it all depends on whether he wants to fight anymore. He keeps talking about this real estate career that he's got going on for him, but then you see that performance, like you said, Simon, against Diego Sanchez, and you're looking at now a 5-fight win streak. Of course, there's been that 2-year gap, but he's a phenomenal talent, and he's still very much young enough to have a long career in the sport. And it's just a shame, especially at 155 pounds right now, where you've got a group of guys in the top end. Fine, fair enough, but where's that kind of next 2 or 3 guys? And Al Iaquinta could be at the very forefront of that next wave of guys, could be chomping at the bit in the next couple of years for a title shot, very, very quickly. And when you've got a mouth like he has, when you've got a social media presence like he has right now, and when you've got the in-cage ability that he's shown just last weekend, I mean, that's dynamite stuff right there.
Yeah, I think he just needs to get the UFC on side. And if he can still be him and be that outspoken personality, but channel it into a different direction. I'm not saying he shouldn't complain about the things that he thinks are just, but by all means go out and do that and say your piece. But telling your employer "f you" in every available interview opportunity, that doesn't really seem to help him when it comes to improving his future and helping him get a better deal, because Conor McGregor is super rich and successful for two reasons. One, he wins fights, and two, he knows how to play the game. It isn't just mindless yapping, and I think this is where some people get it wrong. It's like they say, "Oh yeah, he's just mouthing, he's just talking." He isn't. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he's saying, and he's saying it within the confines of what makes sense. And even when it looked like there was the suggestion of a rift between him and the UFC, that got patched up like that really quick. He had that quote retirement tweet, thanks for the cheese and all that stuff. And we all hell broke loose for a few weeks, but eventually they sat down, boom, everything's sorted, no drama. That's what we need to have without Iaquinta here. We've got an outspoken personality who's a phenomenal fighter. They just need to give him the platform that he deserves. But him really mouthing off in the way that he has, he said his initial bit, and you can put the first one down to frustration, but the second, third, fourth, fifth, once you start getting into that territory, he's that's calculated. He knows he's going to say these things, so that's when it gets tricky. I think someone needs to just wind him in a bit, tell him you've got to play the game here, and if he keeps fighting in the octagon and producing performances like that, the UFC are going to have no option but to push him up there. And in that lightweight division, there's so many good fights in there, and there's more coming because Justin Gaethje looks like he's about to join. So, there's so many good fights in that division. Stay relevant, stay active, don't completely alienate yourself from your employer, and you'll end up earning, because he's too good not to.
Bit of a follow-up from Johnny Byrne, who says, is Al Iaquinta's humour on Twitter going to make him a bigger star or get him his walking papers? I mean, if you had to make a bold prediction right now, Simon, if Al Iaquinta keeps doing what he's doing, do you think eventually the UFC will be like, look, we can't handle this, we're not able to kind of come to terms with him behind the scenes, he's going to keep slagging off the UFC, the brand, the product on social media. If we put him into a fight, all of his fight interviews will be slagging off the UFC. If he wins and Brian Stann sticks a microphone in his face in a post-fight interview in a co-main event on Fox Sports 1, he probably won't have the nicest thing to say about the promotion. Do they just kind of cut loose with him and give him the release, or what do you think? Or do you think they just sit back, keep booking him if he wants to fight, that is, and hope that what he's doing eventually makes him to a bigger star?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? I mean, my initial thought is, if Al carries on the way he's carrying on, I think all that will happen is the UFC could potentially offer him an alright deal and say, take it or leave it. If you want to test the market, that's fine. And in the end, it'll be a choice of real estate or Bellator. Because Bellator would love him, right?
Mm-hmm.
An outspoken character who's been very vocal against the UFC, but is absolutely smashing people to bits and is a top 10, maybe top 5 contender in their strongest weight class. You can bet Bellator will open the checkbook and welcome him with open arms. Absolutely no doubt about it. But there's also the possibility that might be what he's angling for anyway. And if the UFC think that, then they might take a different route and play hardball with him a little bit. I don't know. I mean, on the face of it, I think if he carries on the way he's carrying on, I can't see him fighting with the UFC beyond his current contract. Something needs to change because he clearly isn't happy. And unless the UFC turn around in negotiations and put their hands and go, you know what, you're right, we'll give you all these things. That's not going to happen. So at some point, they're going to need to come together around a negotiating table. Cool heads are going to have to prevail. And at that point, hopefully, we'll see the best of Al Iaquinta in the next stage of his career. But if he carries on the way he's carrying on now, I can't see anything for him other than Bellator or quitting. Because I don't think the UFC will want too much to do with him if he carries on like this.
Yeah. We've got a couple of questions, no surprise, in relation to this past weekend's boxing at Wembley Stadium. So I'll read them both out and then we can get into it. Graham Hughes says, if McGregor headlined with a decent card, there's absolutely no reason the UFC could sell out Wembley, is there? And then our good friend from Yahoo Sports, Liam Happ, tweets in and says, if the UFC ever themselves run Wembley Stadium, which fight is headline? So I'll take a stab at this first. I think the answer to both questions is Conor McGregor. I think that's who you get to headline, A. And B, yes, I think McGregor could definitely sell out Wembley Stadium. He's the one guy, he's the one UFC fighter that everyone in the sports world here in the UK knows very, 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 very well. He's the one guy that gets coverage from Sky Sports, that gets coverage from BBC. You'll have every single media outlet clamoring over themselves to get a piece of the action if he was to ever headline an event in Wembley Stadium. He'd get all the attention and all the hype and the promotion leading up to it that the Joshua fight got prime time here in the UK. And you know what? I think with McGregor, perhaps you don't need the strongest undercard. You know, I think with McGregor, if it's the Diaz rematch, great. If it's him going for a welterweight title, great. You know, if there's some sort of historic angle to what he's trying to do, fantastic, great. And honestly, I just love to see that. You know, you look back at the history of other combat sports, you know, and you look at what Muhammad Ali did, you know, with the Rumble in the Jungle, and you know, I just love seeing when combat sports just uproot just for a one-off, a special event, and just by relocating to a different country or a different city, it adds that special event feel to it. And the UFC have done this themselves. When they did Ronda Rousey Holly Holm, that had a special event feel to it. When they broke into the Canadian market in Ontario specifically, and they went in to the Rogers Centre with Jake Shield and GSP, that had a special event feel to it. You know, they haven't gone back since. You know, because they can't go back without GSP. So, yeah, I mean, I don't even think you need a second title fight. I'm sure, knowing the UFC, they would stack it anyway, like they normally do, just in case you get, you know, a freak injury and, you know, you get one of the headliners, especially McGregor, pulling out. But, you know, McGregor can do whatever he wants now. And we're seeing it right now with this Mayweather situation. He is one of the biggest sports stars in the world, let alone one of the biggest combat sports stars or one of the biggest MMA stars in the world. He is right up there with your Ronaldos and your Anthony Joshuas and your Rory McIlroys and Lewis Hamiltons. He is right up there. So bring Conor McGregor and Diaz over for their trilogy fight, and we'll take that all day long.
Yeah, I reckon we'll take that. And the other thing, I mean, as you say, they could put on a card and pack it full of British and Irish fighters who are on the UFC books, much like they do when they come over anyway. They could slap McGregor versus Diaz or McGregor versus the cleaning lady. It doesn't matter. McGregor versus someone as the main event. 2 named fighters in the co-main event. And that'll do nicely. People will come just for the McGregor effect. Maybe Ronda Rousey could do that. But her star is somewhat tarnished a little bit now. And I think, you know, the media attention will be huge. Could she sell out 90,000 at Wembley? I don't know. I'm not so sure she could. Conor, absolutely. If Conor McGregor tomorrow said, "Where Joshua did Wembley, I'll sell it out quicker," and then they announce it, you know, you could do flipping McGregor versus Diaz anywhere in the world, and that place will sell out. Cowboys Stadium, no problem, he'd sell that. You know, the Maracanã, no problem, sell that. It doesn't matter. You know, he is the biggest combat sports star in the world today. Boxing, mixed martial arts, thumb wrestling, whatever you want it to be, he is the number one guy. He's the biggest draw. So that's why we want him back in the octagon, Sandhu. This is the thing, you know. The Mayweather fight is all well and good, and you know whether it happens or not, and who, you know, God only knows what's going to happen with that. I want him back in the octagon. He's a mixed martial artist. He's the number 2 according to the official rankings right now. You know, make of that what you will. But he's the number 2 pound for pound fighter in the world right now. And for me, he's top five anyway. But he's that good. He's that good, and he's a superstar. I want him back in the cage. I don't care whether it's in Vegas, uh, you know, London, Timbuktu, Australia. I don't care anywhere. Just get him back in the cage. Let's get the sport's biggest star active in the sport again. That's what we need.
That does it for the questions, but just to round out the show, Simon, I thought it'd be good just to kind of share a few musings and share a few thoughts in regards to the sport in terms of what's been on your mind over the course of the last 7 days. Anything that you want to share, discuss, talk about before we kind of call it a day today?
There's nothing that's sort of absolutely huge that leaps out at me, except for the fact that I think we're in a really interesting spell right now with the story of the ownership of the UFC is a really, really interesting one, and we aren't yet at the stage where we know just what the potential is like. Now, Dana White put out an interview with Megan O'Leary this week. It was filmed weeks ago, but it was a few weeks ago, I think. And some of the things that Dana came out with were very interesting, talking about just the excitement of him. He's a promoter. It's his job to be excited about his product. But some of the things that he was saying about the stuff that they've got planned for further down the line, it makes me wonder just how they're going to do this and just how big this sport can get. I also am particularly keen to see how they deal with compensating fighters as well. We talked in previous shows about how we can improve things on that scale, and I talked about having knockout bonus or having finish bonuses rather than win and show and all that sort of stuff. The sport is still really young. As an organised sport, mixed martial arts is still really young. And I think it's very easy, especially for us guys who are so immersed in it, to forget that. And as an organised, legitimate, regulated sport, it's less than 20 years old, really. As a legitimate, regulate, and as a mainstream sport, even younger than that. So as a sport, it's got so much growing to do. And the rate of progress to this point has been really, really fast. And we're at a stage now where there's been a lot of media attention on the fact that it's been bought by this huge, huge company. An awful amount of money has been spent. The question now is, what's the next step? And we still don't know, because operationally, or in terms of the product that we see on the TV screens, there really isn't an enormous difference between what we're seeing now and what we saw 12 months ago. So what I'm really looking forward to seeing is just how that progresses, how that changes, and how the sport will get on once it loses its biggest star. Because Conor McGregor isn't going to fight forever. He might not fight in the UFC again. Who knows? I mean, he could fight another 4, 5, 6 times, but eventually they're going to have to move on without him. And how do they produce the next star? And they've done it after Chuck Liddell, GSP, all the rest of it. But this one is different because McGregor has taken it to a level that no one has ever got close to before. And I include Ronda Rousey in this. No one has even got close to what Conor's done. So when he falls away, is the sport going to drop a level as well? There's so many intangibles right now, and I'm fascinated to see how it all works out. I just hope that the momentum isn't lost during this transitional period. We've had not a stellar start to the year. It's been a steady start. I think what we really need now is a big finish to the year. We're getting to the middle portion of the year, and now hopefully we want to see the big fights kicking in, and the next big UFC pay-per-view hopefully will be the start of that, because that fight card is insane, that main card. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And also the other thing, very, very quickly, is I'm encouraged to see how much more MMA we as UK fans have access to now. We've got the UFC. Still haven't quite got Bellator yet, but we're working on that. We're talking to them all the time. Hopefully we'll eventually get them live in the UK. But we've got BAMMA are being shown. They announced this week their next event is going to be shown live on Dave, which is, for those who aren't in the UK, it's a TV channel, shows a lot of male-oriented content, a lot of comedy. The recent David Haye boxing matches were on there. Not a terrible fit for BAMMA. I think it will work quite nicely on there. And you've got Cage Warriors, obviously, on BT Sport and UFC Fight Pass. So I'm looking forward to seeing how the sport develops in the next few years. It feels like a period of transition right now. And, hopefully this next big pay-per-view will really see the MMA year catch fire again. That's my hope, anyway.
Well, that was some heavy stuff there, Simon. I was kind of looking to see what was on your mind more in the short term. But some of what you said there does transition nicely into what's been on my mind, and on my mind is a fantastic month of May coming up. We've got Bellator coming to the UK, to the SSE Arena in London, neighbours Wembley Stadium actually, and formerly known as Wembley Arena, and it's going to be Paul Daley versus Rory McDonald, which in my opinion is the best fight so far that we're going to get in MMA, specifically in the UK. No disrespect to Jimmy Manuel and Corey Anderson. That was a great fight to have here as well. But Paul Daley and Rory McDonald, that gets my juices going. And I think it was a right move for Bellator to get away from the O2, go to the SSC, which I think is a more manageable arena for them to try and fill to capacity, especially with this card. We're also going to have the return of Michael Venom Page. So that's coming up in just a couple of weeks, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that on one of our shows in the forthcoming weeks. We'll both be there covering it to our best of our ability. But then the UFC has also got their next European show with Glover Teixeira and Alexander Gustafsson, and that goes down on Sunday, May 28th. I'll be at both of those, so I'm looking forward to kind of getting a bit of fight week action and coverage from both of those. And then, like you said, Simon, UFC 211, it really is the best pay-per-view on paper that the UFC have brought to the market so far this year. So yeah, just looking forward in the short term to an interesting month of MMA. Always good to get the Bellator boys over here to kind of pick their brains, see what's next on the horizon. I wouldn't even be too shocked if things go well here at the SSC in a couple of weeks' time, that perhaps they might even bring a second UK show at the back end of 2017. We've seen them do that last year with a couple of shows in Ireland. So let's see if they can do that here in England, maybe back-to-back shows in London, especially with some of their biggest kind of stars, with like Liam McGeary, Michael Page, Rory McDonald, Paul Daley, Linton Vassell. These are all guys that can kind of shift tickets for them here in this market. So yeah, looking forward to a good couple of weeks to be on the road, so to speak.
Yeah, it's going to be good fun. And does that pretty much wrap us up this week, Sandhu?
Short and sweet.
Excellent. Within the hour as well. Who'd have thought it? Thank you so much to everybody who listened this week. We will preview UFC 211 and next week. You can tweet us at the BritPack MMA. You can check out the website at thebritpackmma.com. You can subscribe. I believe it's not called iTunes anymore. It's called Apple Podcasts. Whatever you want to call it, subscribe on it. You can subscribe on Stitcher, Acast, SoundCloud, and anywhere else you can find half-decent podcasts. Hopefully ours will be there as well. We're on YouTube as well if you want to check us out on there in audio form. Thank you everybody for listening. That was episode number 37. Get questions into us ahead of next week's show at the BritPack MMA. Tweet Sandhu at Sandhu MMA and me at Simon Head. That was the BritPack. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll speak to you